Hey besties, welcome back to Maggie Stories. What happens when a controlling man meets a woman who has never once in her life been controllable?
The morning Athalia Josephine Pierre Baptiste discovered her husband had installed a tracking application on her phone. She did not cry. She did not throw the phone. She did not even raise her voice. She simply sat at the edge of their bed. Their enormous, obscenely comfortable bed in their enormous, obscenely beautiful apartment in Yongsan-gu. Crossed one leg over the other, looked at the app blinking cheerfully on her screen like it had done nothing wrong, and said, quietly to no one in particular, "So he wants to die today." Her name was Athalia Josephine Pierre Baptiste Kwan, and she had been many things in her 31 years on this earth. She had been a gap-toothed child who terrorized the Seoul subway system with her off-key singing. She had been a student who graduated top of her architecture cohort at Yonsei University, while also somehow maintaining a social life that her professors found personally offensive. She had been the daughter of Marlene and Edouard Pierre Baptiste, two Haitian immigrants who had arrived in Seoul with suitcases, ambition, and absolutely no plan to be average, and had watched them quietly, methodically, build a real estate empire across the city while raising her to be the kind of woman who does not apologize for existing loudly. She had been all of these things. And now she was the wife of Kwan Sai-hyun, 34 years old, CFO of Kwan Holdings, possessor of a jawline that should have been illegal and a controlling streak that absolutely should have been. She found him in the kitchen. He was standing at the island in his dress shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow because God had a sense of humor, drinking his Americano and reading something on his tablet like a man who had not just committed a federal offense against marital trust. Athalia walked in, set her phone face up on the counter between them, and waited. He looked up. Something in her expression made him set down his coffee. "What?" he said. "I have a question," she said pleasantly. "And I need you to answer it slowly, so your brain has time to catch up with your mouth." A muscle in his jaw ticked. "Athalia." "What?" she said, pointing at the phone. "Is LoveGuard Pro doing on my phone?" Sai-hyun? Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind where a man realizes he is standing in a field and the woman across from him is holding a match. He straightened. She watched him do it, watched him pull on the particular posture he used when he was about to say something he had already decided was reasonable. It was a posture she had come to privately call the Kwan Declaration, because it always preceded some statement that was delivered with absolute confidence and was also absolutely unhinged. "I just want to know where you are," he said. "It's not a big deal. It's safety." "Safety," she repeated. "Yes, safety. Athalia." Sai-hyun. She tilted her head. "I am a 31-year-old licensed architect who commutes across one of the most surveilled cities in the world, speaks 3 languages, and once talked a contractor out of a breakdown using only my hands and a granola bar. What exactly are you protecting me from?" "I just like knowing." "You like knowing," she said. "You like knowing. As in, you enjoy the sensation of knowing my location at all times. Like I am a package you ordered from Kuong, and you want to make sure I arrive on schedule." "That's not." "Do I need a tracking number?" Sai-hyun? "Should I update my delivery status?" Athalia has left the building. Athalia is in transit. Athalia is currently standing in your kitchen, deciding whether to be your wife or your warden's greatest nightmare. "I worry," he said, and his voice came out different that time. Lower, less armored. She stopped. She looked at him. Really looked at him, the way she taught herself to do in the 2 years of their marriage. Past the jawline and the pressed shirt and the impenetrable Kwan Holdings boardroom face, down to whatever was sitting underneath it, small and tight and not entirely comfortable with itself. She saw it. She always saw it. She hated that she always saw it. "Delete it," she said, her voice still firm but no longer a roast. "Delete it today, Sai-hyun. And when you want to know where I am, you call me. Like a person. Like my husband. And I will pick up, because I am your wife, not your property. And I actually like talking to you when you are not being like this." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he picked up her phone, opened the app, and deleted it. She watched him do it. "Thank you," she said. He handed the phone back, picked up his Americano, and walked out of the kitchen. She heard the front door close. Not slam, just close. And she stood alone in the kitchen that cost more than most people's annual salary, stared at the marble countertop, and exhaled. She was not naive. She knew this was not over. She had known, if she was honest, from the very beginning. The beginning was 4 years ago, at a dinner party hosted by Young Myung-sik, one of the most connected developers in Seoul, and incidentally one of her parents' oldest friends in Korea. The Pierre Baptiste had been in Seoul since Athaliah was 8 years old. Her parents had arrived chasing a specific vision, stayed because the city rewarded those who showed up with their whole chest, and by the time Athaliah was finishing university, Pierre Baptiste Real Estate occupied 4 floors of an office building in Gangnam and had its name on more development projects than most firms twice its size. People knew her parents, respected them. That was a particular thing in Seoul, to be known and respected not because you had performed respectability, but because you had simply shown up and done the work consistently until the city had no choice but to make room for you. Her father Edouard had a laugh that filled rooms. Her mother Marlene wore her Haitian elegance like a second skin. The way she arranged flowers, the way she lit candles before meals, the particular way she said grace that made everyone at the table feel they had briefly touched something sacred. Athaliah had grown up at the intersection of these two worlds, Korean and Haitian, Seoul and something older, something her parents carried in their bodies and their language and the way they moved through life as though beauty was not a luxury but a practice. She had grown up bilingual and then trilingual, had grown up eating at the tables of Seoul's elite while also growing up with her grandmother's voice in cassette recordings her mother played on Sunday mornings, had grown up knowing who she was with the kind of specificity that made her difficult to rattle. So when she met Kwon Si-hyun at Young Myung-sik's dinner, she was not rattled. She was, however, briefly, very distracted. He was seated across from her at a long table of 12, and he had the kind of face that architectural photographers would have wept over, all clean lines, deliberate angles, the sort of structure that looked equally good in natural light and candlelight and probably also in a blackout if she was being honest with herself. He had been introduced to her as the eldest son of Kwon Dae-young, patriarch of Kwon Holdings, and he had shaken her hand with the cool efficiency of someone who had shaken many hands and found most of them unremarkable. She had smiled at him. He had not quite smiled back. Interesting, she had thought. Rude, she had also thought. But interesting. They had been seated near enough for conversation, and the conversation had been fine. He was intelligent. She could tell he was intelligent because he asked questions that were actually questions rather than statements wearing question marks as disguise, which was a habit of people who had never had to genuinely wonder about anything. He had asked her about the Pierre Baptiste firm with what seemed like real curiosity, and she had answered him with the same, and at some point during the C-base course she had made a joke about Seoul's zoning laws that was genuinely quite clever and he had laughed. Not politely, not performatively, but actually laughed, surprised out of it like he hadn't expected her to be funny. She had filed that away. She had also filed away the moment, later in the evening, when she had overheard him on the terrace taking a call. She hadn't meant to listen. She had stepped out for air and there he was, and she had been about to retreat when the tone of his voice stopped her. He was speaking to someone. She couldn't tell who, and his voice had shed the dinner party polish entirely. It was quiet and controlled and slightly cold, and he was saying, in Korean, "I don't care what she said. I need to know where she went. Find out." Athaliah had stood very still on the terrace. Then she had gone back inside. She had told herself it could have been anything. Business. A misunderstanding. Context she didn't have. She had dated him for 8 months before the wedding. In those 8 months she had seen flashes, the way he sometimes asked where she was going before she left, the way he'd once, early on, suggested that a dress she'd worn to a gallery opening was too much, the way his eyes would sometimes track her phone like it was a variable he needed to account for. She had also seen him learn, when she pushed back. And she always pushed back, immediately, without cruelty but without softness either. He would stop, go quiet. Sometimes he would leave the room and come back different like he'd had an argument with himself and wasn't sure who'd won. She had married him knowing it would be work. She had also married him knowing she was not afraid of work. What she had not fully anticipated was his father. Kwon Dae-young was 70 years old and had the energy of a man who had spent 7 decades being correct and found the experience extremely pleasant. He was not outwardly unkind. He was, in fact, very charming, in the manner of men who have always had the resources to make their character seem like a gift rather than a transaction. He had welcomed Athaliah into the family with grace and warmth and several very genuine compliments about her work in architecture. He had also, within the first 3 months of her marriage, done the following things. Suggested to Si-hyun, in front of Athaliah, that perhaps she was taking on too much with her firm's new commercial project. referenced the fact that his own wife had known how to be a support, accompanied by a glance towards Saihan's mother, Min Young, who had sat at the dinner table and smiled the particular smile of someone who had been smiling at things they should not have smiled at for a very long time, and asked Athaliah, once, with apparently genuine curiosity, why she didn't let Saihan handle things. Let Saihan handle things. Athaliah had looked at Kwan Dae-young across the dinner table. This beautiful table in this beautiful house with this beautiful family and its very ugly inheritance. And she had said, very politely, handle which things exactly, Abioji? My firm? My projects? My schedule? I'm curious what you imagine he'd do with them. Silence. She had watched Dae-young blink. She had watched Saihan go very still beside her. She had watched Min-young look down at her bowl. I mean, Athaliah had continued pleasantly, I'm sure he'd do his best, but I've built something I'm proud of, and I'd hate for it to be handled when it's running perfectly fine on its own. You understand. She had smiled at Dae-young. He had smiled back. It was the smile of two people who understood each other completely and had decided this conversation was not over. She had been right. It was absolutely not over. But then neither was she. There was a particular sound Athaliah had come to recognize in her marriage. It was not an argument. It was not a door slamming or a voice raised or any of the dramatic acoustics that people imagined when they thought about a difficult marriage. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of Saihan's footsteps slowing outside whatever room she was in. A brief hesitation, barely a second, before he walked through the door, like he was preparing himself, like he needed to prepare himself. For his own wife, in his own home. She had noticed it about 4 months into the marriage and had found it, at first, baffling. Then she had thought about it more carefully, about who had raised him and how and what a boy learned when he grew up watching his father treat every room his mother entered as a room that needed to be managed, and the baffling had shifted into something more complicated. She understood it. She simply refused to accommodate it. The outfit incident happened on a Thursday. Athaliah had a site visit, one of her firm's projects. A mixed-use development in Mapogu that she had been working on for 18 months and was, frankly, one of the most interesting things she had ever designed. She was dressed and ready by 8. Wide-leg trousers in a deep rust color, a fitted cream blouse, her good boots, and a long structured coat that her mother had helped her pick out in Paris 2 years ago and that remained, in Athaliah's professional opinion, one of the greatest garments in human history. She was checking her bag when Saihan appeared in the doorway of their bedroom. He looked at her. Then he looked at the coat. Then he looked at her again, and she could see it happening, the thing she had started calling the calculation, which was the moment his face did the particular rearrangement that preceded him saying something he had decided was a reasonable observation and was not. You're wearing that to a site visit? He said. Athaliah did not look up from her bag. I'm wearing this to my life, Saihan. The site visit is just where my life is going today. It's a construction site. I'm aware. I designed it. It's just, he paused, recalibrated. She could feel him doing it. It seems like a lot. She looked up then. She looked at him for a long moment, at her husband, in his perfectly fitted charcoal suit, who had never once been told that his clothes were a lot, and she said, a lot of what? He opened his mouth. Before you answer, she said pleasantly, I want you to think very carefully about the next word that comes out of your mouth, because we are going to be talking about it for the rest of the day regardless of what it is, and I would like you to at least have chosen it intentionally. He closed his mouth. Smart man sometimes. I just meant, he said more carefully, that it might not be practical. My coat, the color, is rust, which I selected because I wanted to, which is information that should have ended this conversation before it started. She picked up her bag. Saihan, who dresses you? He blinked. What? Every morning. Who decides what you wear? I do. And does anyone stand in your doorway and tell you it's a lot? Silence. Because I've seen your Tuesday meeting suit, she continued. The navy one with the pocket square situation. And I have thoughts. But I keep them to myself. Because you are a grown man and your clothes are not my jurisdiction. She walked past him toward the hallway. Mine are not yours. We clear. He turned to watch her go. The coat looks good, he said after a moment. I know, she said without turning around. I have eyes. She came home that evening to find him in the living room, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he was sitting in the armchair near the window. Not at his desk, not on his laptop, just sitting, with a glass of water and an expression she couldn't immediately read. She set down her bag, took off the coat, hung it with the particular care it deserved. "Long day?" she asked. "I called my mother today," he said. She looked over at him. "She said something," he continued, and then stopped, as though he was deciding how much of it to offer. Athaliah sat down on the couch across from him, tucked one leg under herself, and waited. This was one of the things she had learned. That Heir, when he was actually trying to say something real, needed a moment of silence to find it. He had not been raised in a house that was patient with real things. Real things in the Kwan household had historically been rerouted through practicality or simply not said at all. "She said she was glad I married you," he said finally. Athaliah raised an eyebrow. "She said that today? Out of nowhere. I called to check on her. She brought it up. She said..." He looked at his water glass. "She said she had been watching you. How you never let things happen to you without responding to them." The quiet between them was different from the usual quiet. "She said she wished she had done that," he said. "When she was younger." Athaliah was silent for a moment. Then she said gently, "Your mother is remarkable, you know." He looked up. "She absorbed 40 years of a certain kind of marriage," Athaliah said. "And she is still warm, still gracious, still has her whole self in there. I can see it when she talks about the things she cares about. That is not a small thing, Heir. That is somebody who protected something in herself very carefully for a very long time." She paused. "But she deserved better than to have to protect it that way." He looked at her with an expression she had only seen a handful of times. Unguarded, a little undone. "I don't want to be my father," he said. "I know. I'm not." He stopped, started again. "I know that I do things." "You do," she agreed, because she was not going to perform surprise about this. "The phone was unacceptable." "Yes," he said it flatly, taking it on. "The comments about your clothes are also unacceptable." "I know. And the asking where I'm going every time I leave the apartment." He exhaled. "Is that one still happening?" "Tuesday. You asked where I was going, then asked how long I'd be, then asked who I was meeting. 3 questions, Heir. For a coffee run." He pressed his hand over his face. She watched him. "Here is the thing," she said, and her voice had shifted. Not softer, exactly, but closer, more direct. "You don't do these things because you're a bad person. I would not have married a bad person. I have too much going on for that." She tilted her head. "You do them because somewhere in your brain there is a voice that sounds like your father telling you that love means control. That if you can't account for someone, you might lose them. That a woman who moves freely is a woman who might not come back." He was very still. "And that voice," she said, "is wrong. And it is also, I say this with love and with my whole chest, not my problem to be controlled over. You understand? Your healing is yours to do. I will walk next to you while you do it. I will not be the place you practice the wound." The room was quiet for a long time. Outside, soul did what soul did, hummed and glittered and moved at its permanent, relentless pace. "How are you like this?" he said finally, not unkindly, almost wondering. "Haitian," she said simply, and got up to start dinner. She had started teaching him things the way her mother had taught her. Not through lectures, but through living. Her mother Marlene was a woman who understood that culture was not a museum exhibit. It was not something you displayed in a cabinet and pointed at. It was something you inhabited in the way you cooked, the way you prayed, the way you made a home, the way you marked time. Marlene had raised Athaliah in soul without ever letting soul become the only thing she was. There were rituals. In their home, Sunday meals that began with a particular prayer, the way her mother arranged the table for guests, the herbs her father grew on their apartment balcony and tended with the seriousness of someone who understood that some things must be carried with you when you cross water. Athaliah had brought those things into her marriage without announcement. She simply lived them. The first thing Heir noticed was the candles. She lit them in the evenings, not for ambience exactly, or not only for ambience. Her mother had taught her that light in a home was intentional. That you called in what you wanted with what you tended. She had small candles on the kitchen windowsill and a larger one on the dining table, and she lit them in the evenings when she was home, and sometimes she said things quietly to herself while she did it. Not loudly, not performatively, just present with the act of it. Saihayan had watched her do this for 2 weeks before he asked. "What are you saying?" he said, not suspiciously, genuinely curious. "Gratitude," she said. "Mostly. Sometimes a request. Sometimes just a reminder to myself." A reminder of what? She considered the candle for a moment. That the day was real, she said. That I was in it. That what I did mattered even when it didn't feel like it. My grandmother taught my mother, and my mother taught me. You mark the day, or the day just disappears. He had stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her in the candlelight and said nothing. But the next evening, he had come home and stood near her while she lit them, not asking to participate, just near. She had counted that as progress. The second thing was a Sunday. Athaliah hosted her parents for Sunday dinner, a thing she had done monthly since the marriage, and which Saihayan had attended with varying degrees of comfort. He was polite with Edouard and Marlene. They were warm with him because they were warm people, but there was a particular way Marlene watched him. An assessment that was invisible to everyone except Athaliah, who had grown up being assessed by those eyes and knew exactly what they were doing. This particular Sunday, Athaliah made the full meal, the kind that took most of the day, that her mother had taught her on weekend afternoons in their old apartment in Mapo, while explaining that cooking for people was a form of prayer if you did it with intention. Saihayan came into the kitchen at noon while she was working. "Can I help?" he said. She looked at him. He was still in his Saturday clothes. More relaxed than his usual presentation, softer somehow, and he looked slightly uncertain in the way he only ever looked when he wasn't performing anything. "You know how to cut plantains?" she said. He blinked. "I can learn." She handed him a knife. The next 40 minutes were genuinely chaotic. He cut the first one too thin, the second one crooked, managed the third one adequately, and held up the fourth one to show her with the expression of a man who had just done something he found surprisingly satisfying. "Better," she said. "They look good," he said. "They look like a work in progress," she said. "Like someone." He looked at her sideways. She was already turned back to the stove. By the time her parents arrived, the apartment smelled like something real, the kind of cooking smell that gets into the walls and stays, that signals that something more than food is happening. Marlene walked in and stopped in the hallway and closed her eyes briefly. And Athaliah watched her mother do this and felt something warm move through her chest. She smells home, she thought. We made home here. Edouard shook Saihayan's hand and then, in the way of men who have a language beyond language, put his other hand on Saihayan's shoulder briefly. Just a second. And Athaliah watched her husband receive this and not quite know what to do with it. At the dinner table, her father told a story. A long, winding, hilarious story. About their first apartment in Seoul, about a neighbor and a misunderstanding involving a package and a very expensive orchid. And the table was laughing, and at some point Athaliah looked over at Saihayan and found him laughing too. Actually laughing. Not the performance of it. She reached under the table and put her hand on his. He turned his palm up and held it. The breaking point, or the breaking open point, because there is a difference, happened because of his father. It was a Sunday 3 weeks later, a Kwan family dinner at the main house in Songbukdong, and Athaliah arrived in a cobalt wrap dress that her mother had helped her find in a small boutique in Insadong. With her good earrings and her good posture, and the specific energy of a woman who had chosen to be exactly as present as she wanted to be. Minyoung met them at the door. Saihayan's mother was 63 years old and had the bones of someone who had once been very vivid and had learned, over time, to arrange herself more quietly. She was not diminished, not exactly, but she moved with a particular carefulness, like someone navigating a room they had mapped so thoroughly they could do it in the dark. She looked at Athaliah and her face did something small and complicated. "You look wonderful," she said. "So do you," Athaliah said, and kissed her cheek. "That color is perfect on you." Iamianim. Minyoung touched the sleeve of her own blouse. Pale blue, lovely, as though she was surprised to be reminded she was wearing it. Inside, Daeyoung was in the sitting room with Saihayan's younger brother Juwon, and 2 men Athaliah recognized as business associates. She greeted everyone, took her seat, declined a drink because she preferred water, and watched Daeyoung clock this the way he always clocked her small choices, cataloging them as data. The dinner was fine. It was always fine in the way of dinners that have very good food and very careful conversation. It went sideways during dessert. The business associates had left. It was family only, and Dae-jung was in the particular expansive mood that came from a successful week in good wine, and he was telling a story about a deal that had closed, and the story involved a woman, a lawyer on the opposing side, and the way Dae-jung told it, the humor came at the expense of this woman's persistence, her insistence, her refusal to simply let things be resolved. He was doing the voice, the imitation of her. The table was doing the polite laugh. Athaliah set down her spoon. "She sounds like she was excellent at her job," she said. Dae-jung paused mid-impression. "She was difficult," he said. "You spent 4 minutes of a story on her?" Athaliah said pleasantly. "That's usually a sign that someone was extremely good at their job." Juwon made a sound that could have been a cough. Dae-jung looked at Athaliah with the expression of a man who was deciding how to respond to something without acknowledging that it had landed. "It's just an interesting thing," Athaliah continued in her most conversational voice. "How the same quality gets 2 different names depending on who has it. In a man, persistence is strategy. In a woman, it's difficulty. I've been thinking about that a lot lately." She picked her spoon back up. "The bingsu is wonderful, Iamianim. Is this from the place in Bukshan?" Minyoung blinked. "Yes," she said, and then, slightly surprised, "You've been there." "My mother loves it," Athaliah said. "She dragged my father there every summer for years. He pretended to find it too sweet and then ate 3 portions. Minyoung laughed. "Not the careful version. The real one." It was a small sound, but it changed the temperature of the entire room. Dae-jung was looking at his daughter-in-law with an expression Athaliah had not seen on his face before. Not displeasure. Not the chess match calculation she was used to. Something more like recalibration. Across the table, Saihayan was very still. But under the table, in a move that no one saw, his hand found her knee, and stayed there. There is a moment in every stubborn thing, a wall, a habit, a man raised wrong, where the resistance stops being strength and starts being exhaustion. Athaliah had been waiting for that moment with the patience of someone who had grown up watching her mother tend things. Her mother Marlene tended everything with the same quality of attention. Her plants, her marriage, her faith, her friendships, her grief. She did not rush any of it. She had a saying that Athaliah had heard so many times as a child that it had become the wallpaper of her interior life. The river does not argue with the stone. It simply keeps moving until the stone remembers what it is, which is something that can be worn down. Athaliah had thought about that river her entire marriage. She thought about it on the morning Saihayan woke up before her, which he rarely did, and she found him in the kitchen not working, not on his phone, not doing anything productive by the Kwan Holdings definition of productive. He was standing at the window with his coffee, watching the city wake up, and when she appeared in the doorway he turned and looked at her with an expression that was so undefended it briefly stopped her in her tracks. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just," he paused. "I was thinking about what you said. About my mother." She moved to the kitchen, started the kettle, gave him the room to continue without her looking directly at him, because she had learned that Saihayan said more when no one was watching him say it. "She called me last week," he said. "Again. We talked for almost an hour." "I know. I heard you in the study. She told me," he stopped. She could hear him turning the mug in his hands. "She told me that she used to have opinions. Before. She said she had all these ideas about how she wanted to live, things she wanted to build, a garden she wanted to design. She was interested in garden design." "Did you know that?" Athaliah turned slowly. "I didn't know that," she said quietly. "Neither did I." He looked at his coffee. "I grew up in that house and I never knew my own mother had something she wanted to build." His jaw moved. "Because my father's way of loving her left no room for her to be anything except his wife. And she," he exhaled, "she just let it happen. She let it accumulate. She survived it," Athaliah said carefully. "That is also something. It shouldn't have been something she needed to survive." His voice was flat, not angry at Athaliah, angry at something older and larger than this kitchen. She should have just been able to live. The kettle came to a boil. Athaliah poured her tea. She came and stood next to him at the window. Not in front of him, not facing him, just next to him. both of them looking at Sol doing its morning stretches below. "You are not your father," she said. "I have been doing his habits." "You have been doing his habits," she agreed. "And you have also been, every time I pushed back, stopping." "That is not nothing, Saihayan. That is actually everything." He was quiet. "Your father never stopped," she said. "I have been here 2 years. Count how many times you stopped." She didn't wait for him to count. She picked up her tea and went to get dressed, because she had a 9 o'clock meeting, and because she understood that some things needed to be planted and then left alone to find their own way toward light. The garden happened 6 weeks later. It had been Athaliah's idea, which meant it had not announced itself as an idea but had simply emerged from a Sunday afternoon in Songbukdong when she had arrived at the main house early and found Min Yung in the back of the property, standing in what had once clearly been a proper garden and was now largely ornamental manicured, maintained by the household staff, alive but not tended in any personal sense. Min Yung was standing at the edge of it with her arms crossed over her chest, looking at a section near the back wall where something had once been planted in rows and now wasn't. Athaliah came and stood beside her. "What was here?" she said. Min Yung startled slightly, then softened. "Herbs," she said. "A long time ago, I used to grow them." She paused. "Your father-in-law felt the space could be better used." The two women stood side by side in the quiet of the garden. "What kind of herbs?" Athaliah said. Min Yung looked at her. "All kinds," she said, and her voice had shifted. Younger somehow, more inhabited. "Perilla, chrysanthemum, some that my own mother used to grow that I brought from home. Before." She touched the edge of the empty bed with one foot. "I had plans once. I took courses. Landscape and garden design. I was going to—" She stopped herself, smiled the careful smile. "That was very long ago." "Iamianim," Athaliah said. Min Yung looked at her. "Would you like to plant something?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a question arriving somewhere it had not been expected. Somewhere that had been closed for so long it had almost forgotten it had a door. "Dae-Yung would." "I'm not asking Dae-Yung," Athaliah said. "I'm asking you." They planted on the following Saturday. Athaliah arrived with her mother, because Marlene Pierre-Baptiste was not a woman you kept out of a garden, and also because there are things that women pass between each other in soil and sunlight that do not have translations into anything except the act itself. Marlene had brought seeds and a particular knowledge and the ability to fill a garden with warm, undemanding conversation that somehow made everyone in her vicinity feel that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The four of them, Marlene, Athaliah, Min Yung, and Saihayan's younger sister-in-law who had heard about it and invited herself with a contribution of gardening gloves, spent 4 hours in the back garden of the Kwan house doing something that had not been done there in decades. Making something. Min Yung, who had arrived at the garden in her careful way, arms slightly crossed, smile slightly managed, was, by the second hour, on her knees in the earth with her sleeves rolled up, explaining to Marlene the particular conditions that Perilla preferred, and Marlene was listening with the quality of attention that was her greatest gift, the fullness of it, and Min Yung kept looking up mid-sentence as though checking that she was not taking up too much space, and Marlene kept looking back at her as though the question was absurd. At one point Athaliah looked up from what she was doing and saw Min Yung laugh. Really laugh, head back, unself-conscious, at something Marlene had said, and the sound of it moved through the garden like the first warm day after a long winter. She looked back down at her hands in the dirt. There you are, she thought. There she is. Dae-Yung found them at hour 3. He came out from the house in his weekend clothes, which were still, being Dae-Yung, impeccably pressed, and stood at the edge of the garden looking at his wife on her knees in the earth, sleeves rolled up, hands dirty, mid-conversation with a Haitian woman she had known for 2 years and was apparently, by all available evidence, deeply comfortable with. He stood there for a long moment. Athaliah was the one who saw him first. She straightened up, brushed her hands on her work pants, and walked over to him, because she had learned that Kwan men required the conversation to come to them before they could find their way into it. "A bioji," she said. "What is all this?" he said, not unkindly, genuinely at a loss. "Iamianim is planting her herb garden," Athaliah said. "The one she designed a long time ago. She's been waiting to get back to it." Dae-Yung looked at his wife again. Min Yung had not looked up. She was still talking to Marlene, still in the full version of herself that the garden had called out of her, and she was— Athaliah watched Dae-Yung see it, glowing in some essential way, not performing anything, not managing anything, just completely present in something she loved. She never said she wanted. Dae-young began. She did, actually, Athaliah said, pleasantly, firmly, the way she said all her most important things. She said it many times, in many ways, the ways that were available to her. Dae-young was quiet. This was, Athaliah realized, the longest she had ever seen Kwon Dae-young be quiet about anything. She took courses, she continued, garden and landscape design. She was building something. She had plans. She looked at him steadily. You raised your son to believe that love means accounting for someone, knowing where they are, managing what they do, deciding what they need before they name it themselves. She paused. I think you learned that somewhere too, Abioji. I don't think you invented it. But I think you kept it going when you could have stopped. Dae-young looked at her. For the first time in 2 years of careful chess match dinners, he looked at her without the calculation. She was happy, he said, and his voice came out smaller than she had ever heard it. I believed that she was. She survived, Athaliah said, which is something she deserves enormous credit for. But survival and happiness are different gardens. And it is not too late to find out what the second one looks like. She left him standing at the edge. She went back to her knees in the dirt. Behind her, after a long moment, she heard Dae-jung's footsteps on the path. And then, Min-jung-ah, a pause, and Min-jung's voice, careful, habitual, already arranging itself. Yes, what are you planting? A longer pause, the surprise of a simple question. Perilla, Min-young said, and chrysanthemum, and Marlene brought something from her home, seeds they carry with them. She's been telling me about it. Can I? Dae-jung's voice, doing something unfamiliar. May I see? Silence. Then Marlene's warm, unhurried voice. Come, let me show you. Edouard learned to garden by accident. It took him 3 seasons to stop killing everything, but he got there. And then the sound of Dae-young lowering himself, carefully, to the edge of the garden bed. Athaliah did not look up. She pressed a seed into the earth and covered it with her palm. The shift in Saihayan did not announce itself. This was the thing about real change, it did not come with a speech. It did not show up at the door with flowers and a declaration, the way it did in the stories that were resolved too quickly. It came quietly, in the accumulation of small and unremarkable moments, the way a room gradually fills with light when you stop blocking the windows one by one. It came in the morning he left for work and said at the door, I'll be home by 7. Do you need anything on my way back? Not when are you going to be home? Not where are you going today? Just, do you need anything? She had looked up from her laptop and looked at him in the doorway and said, Persimmons, if you pass anywhere that has good ones. He had nodded and left. He came home at 7:04 with persimmons. It came in the Sunday she was on a video call with a client that ran 90 minutes long, and when she finally emerged from her study he had made dinner. Not called for delivery. Made dinner, not perfectly, with evidence of at least one consultation with a search engine visible in the number of browser tabs still open on his phone. But made it and set the table, and when she sat down he sat across from her and asked her about the client and then actually listened to the answer. It came in the week she was exhausted. A deadline overlapping with a contractor crisis, overlapping with a family thing on her parents' side that required emotional bandwidth she did not have to spare. And she came home depleted in the bone-deep way, the way that is past tired and into something more like empty, and Saihayan looked at her face when she walked in and did not ask a single question. He drew the bath. He made the tea she liked, the specific one her mother had taught her. Not from a bag, assembled, the way Marlene had shown her, with particular intention. He left it outside the bathroom door without knocking. She sat in the bath and drank the tea and cried a little, which had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with being witnessed correctly after a very long day. And when she came out and found him reading in the bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed and he moved to make room without being asked, and she put her head on his shoulder and they sat like that for a long time not saying anything, and it was good. It was the specific kind of good that two people make when they have chosen each other and chosen each other and chosen each other again across every difficult morning and every small surrender and every moment one of them stopped when they could have kept going. I've been thinking, he said into the quiet. I want to go to someone, he said. A therapist. I looked into it. There's someone who works with, he paused. With people who want to understand the patterns they grew up in. She was quiet. I don't want to keep needing you to correct me, he said. I want to go and figure it out myself, so that what I bring home is better. Not because you demand it, because I want it. She lifted her head and looked at him. His face was the open version. The real one. That, she said, is the most attractive thing you have ever said to me. He looked slightly startled. And that, she added, is a significant statement, because you have a face that makes things very unfair. He laughed. The real one, the one she had been collecting since that dinner party 4 years ago, storing each instance like currency. I'll make the appointment tomorrow, he said. Good, she said. She put her head back on his shoulder. The last conversation with Dae-young happened in the garden. It was 3 months after the planting day. The herb garden was growing, improbably beautifully, with the slightly chaotic energy of something that had been waiting too long for permission and was now making up for lost time. Min-young had been out there every week. Sometimes Marlene came, sometimes she came alone, and the household staff had learned not to volunteer to maintain it because she preferred to do it herself. Dae-young had been out there too. Athaliah knew because Min-young had told her, with the careful casualness of someone trying not to make too much of something in case it disappeared. He asks questions sometimes, Min-young had said, about the plants, what they need. He doesn't always know the right thing to say, but he asks. A pause. He's been asking a lot lately. About what I think. Athaliah had simply nodded and said that sounded like a good development. Now she was in the garden alone, on a late afternoon in early autumn, trimming back one of the herb beds while everyone else was inside. The light was doing the particular golden thing it did in Seoul in October, the kind of light that makes everything look like the last good day before winter, which it often was. She heard Dae-young come out. He sat down on the stone bench near the back wall, the one that faced the garden, and was quiet for a while watching her work. Then, you are not what I expected, she kept trimming. What did you expect? A quieter woman, he said, not meanly. Honestly, you expected someone like Iamianim, she said. When she arrived. A long pause. Yes, he said. And instead you got me. Yes. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. This 70-year-old man who had built an empire and a family and had done both with the same controlling hand and genuinely believed it was love. Do you know what my mother told me? She said. Before my wedding? He shook his head. She said, go in knowing who you are, and don't put that down for anyone. She said, your grandmother crossed water to give you that self. Don't set it down because someone asks you to make room. She looked at the garden. I come from people who carried themselves across very difficult distances. A bioji. My parents brought everything they were from Haiti to Seoul and they held on to it and they planted it here. She gestured at the garden, at the herbs, at the seeds Marlene had brought, at the rows that Min-young had designed and was finally building. This is what that looks like, when you hold on. Dae-young was looking at the garden. I have not been, he stopped. No, she agreed. You haven't. I believed I was providing. You were, she said. Provision without presence, though, is just logistics. Min-young didn't need logistics. She needed you to be curious about her. He was quiet for a very long time. She showed me, he said finally, what she would have designed for this space. She had drawings from the courses she took. She kept them. His voice did the small, undone thing that his son's voice did sometimes, and Athaliah recognized it and understood that it was the same wound, just older. She kept them for 40 years. Of course she did, Athaliah said softly. She's remarkable. I didn't. His voice stopped. She waited. I would like to, he said, with the particular difficulty of a man attempting a language he was taught did not belong to him. Do better. Going forward. I would like to understand how to be curious about her. The way she deserves. Athaliah looked at her father-in-law. She had not expected to feel fond of him. She felt cautiously something approaching it. Start with the drawings, she said. Ask her to show them to you. Ask her to explain what each plant needs. Ask her what she would have done differently if she'd had the space. She paused. And then just listen, without solving, without redirecting, without making it about what's practical. She picked up her garden tool again. Quan men are very solution-oriented. Sometimes the whole point is just to be in the room with someone while they tell you who they are. He sat with that. Your parents, he said eventually. They are. Your father is very different from me. My father, Athaliah said with enormous affection, is an absolute menace who cries at movies and grew up carrying enormous dignity through enormous difficulty and turned out to be the softest person in any room while also being one of the most respected. She smiled at the garden. He is my evidence that those things are not opposites. De-Jong made a sound. She looked over. He was very nearly smiling. Thank you, he said. Athaliah. First time in 2 years that he had used just her name. Not Saihayan's wife. Not a title. Not an implication. Just Athaliah. She nodded once and went back to her garden. On their second wedding anniversary, Saihayan took her to a restaurant in Bukshin that she had mentioned once. Once, 8 months ago, in a passing sentence, and she sat across from him at a small table in a beautiful room and understood that he had been listening. Had stored it. Had planned. He had not told her where they were going. He had simply said, dress how you want to dress. And she had worn the cobalt and her good earrings and her mother's ring that she wore when she wanted to feel held by something old. At the table he gave her a card, which was unusual. Saihayan was not a card person. And she opened it and his handwriting was in it. And what it said was not a declaration in the dramatic sense but was, in fact, more valuable than one. I have been learning to ask instead of assume. I have been learning to make room instead of account for. I am not done learning. I wanted you to know that I know that, and that I am glad it is you I am learning it beside. She read it twice. Then she put it down on the table and looked at her husband, at his careful face and his careful jaw, and the eyes that had slowly, over 2 years, learned to look at her instead of watch her. You're going to make me fix my face in a restaurant, she said. I know. He looked almost guilty. I'm sorry. No, you're not. No, he said, and the smile arrived, the real one, her favorite collection. I'm not. She reached across the table. He met her halfway, which was, she thought, more or less the whole point of everything. Not him crossing all the distance. Not her. Both of them arriving at the middle where the actual life was. Back in Seoul, there was a garden growing in Songbukdong. There was a woman in it most mornings now, hands in the earth, tending the things she had carried and the things she had planted and the things that were finally, improbably, late but not too late, beginning to come up. Her husband came out sometimes and sat on the bench and watched and asked questions. He was learning to ask questions. It was a new language for him. He was not done learning. But he came out every morning, and she was in the garden every morning, and the perilla grew, and the chrysanthemum grew, and the things Marlene had brought from further away than Seoul had names in a language that the soil of this city was only just beginning to learn, and they grew too.
Hello besties, in this story we learn that a man who was never taught the difference between love and control will spend his whole life calling ownership devotion. He doesn't need to be left. He needs to meet a woman who refuses to shrink and have the humility to let her show him the difference. Besties, but that woman is not a rehabilitation center. She is your partner. There's a difference. And some men only learn it when someone finally stops letting them forget it. Thank you so much for watching. Kindly like, subscribe and share.